3 in the morning in Afghanistan. I'm checking email after a 72-hour mission, expecting maybe a photo from home. Instead, I get this message from Linda, my wife of 18 years. Divorce papers. Please review. That's right. My wife divorced me by email while I was deployed overseas. But that's not the worst part. When I opened the attachments, I discovered she had emptied our joint account. $87,000. Gone. She had taken out a $340,000 loan against our house without my signature. 23 years of military service, every penny I had saved while dodging bullets for my country, wiped out with a few mouse clicks while I was half a world away. At that moment, sitting in that concrete bunker in the middle of nowhere, I thought my life was over. I thought I had lost everything, but Linda made one crucial mistake. She had no idea who she was really dealing with. You see, if you stay until the end of this story, you'll discover how a military intelligence officer with 2 decades of experience turned the tables on not just his cheating wife, but an entire criminal network that had been targeting military families across America. And if you are someone who believes that good people shouldn't get trampled by those who exploit trust and loyalty, then you're going to want to hear every detail of what happened next. My name is Jack Crawford, Master Sergeant, 58 years old, 23 years of military intelligence experience. I had spent my career learning to read people, analyze patterns, and detect deception. I could spot lies, track enemy movements, solve intelligence puzzles that stumped others. I thought I knew everything about identifying threats. My mother, Dorothy, 78 at the time and still sharp as a tack, sat in her favorite burgundy armchair, the one we had bought her for her 70th birthday. She was telling my brother Tommy about Christmases past, when we were children growing up in rural Georgia, when money was tight but love was abundant. You know, Jack, Linda had said as she leaned into my shoulder, her familiar perfume mixing with the scent of pine needles, how incredibly lucky we are to have this family. Tommy, 34, and also a veteran who had served 2 tours in Iraq before settling down as a mechanic in Atlanta, had smiled and said, "She always knows how to make you feel like a king when you come home, brother." I remembered the profound warmth of that moment, the sense of completeness that came from being surrounded by the people who mattered most. We had built a good life together. I received $2,400 monthly from military housing allowance. My projected pension would be $3,200 per month when I retired in 18 months. A life insurance policy worth $450,000 protected my family's future. We owned our home outright, had solid credit, and had managed to save enough for Dorothy's care in her final years and for Tommy's kids' college funds. Linda always asked detailed questions about my deployment schedule, always expressed genuine concern about my safety, always wanted to know when I would be coming home. She sent care packages filled with my favorite snacks and handwritten letters that kept my spirits up during the darkest moments overseas. But now, sitting in that cold concrete room half a world away, I realized with growing horror that she had stopped asking those questions months ago. I had thought she had simply grown accustomed to my absences, that our relationship had matured beyond the need for constant reassurance. It turned out she was waiting for the exact moment when I would be furthest away, most vulnerable, and completely unable to stop her. The next morning, after a sleepless night staring at the ceiling and analyzing every detail of what had happened, I went to the base computer lab with Staff Sergeant Mike O'Brien, a 26-year-old IT specialist from Ohio, who had become a trusted friend over the months we had served together. Mike was sharp, discreet, and understood the importance of keeping personal problems from affecting unit morale. "Sarge, you look like hell," Mike said when he saw the dark circles under my eyes and the tension in my jaw. "Everything okay back home?" "Just need to check some accounts," I replied vaguely, unwilling to reveal the full extent of my humiliation to a soldier young enough to be my son. When I logged into our Wells Fargo, Navy Federal Credit Union, and USA accounts, the full reality of my situation became crystal clear. It wasn't just that the joint checking account had been drained. Linda had used her financial power of attorney, a document I had signed years ago as a standard precaution for deployed military families, to execute transactions I never authorized. She had transferred money from our savings, closed our certificates of deposit, and even liquidated my retirement accounts, paying massive early withdrawal penalties that I would somehow have to answer for with the IRS. But the strangest and most disturbing discovery was when I checked the VA benefits portal. There were multiple disability claims applications that I had never submitted, filed under my Social Security number, and using medical records I had never seen. Someone with detailed knowledge of VA procedures and military medical terminology had been systematically filing false claims using my identity. That was the moment my intelligence training fully kicked in. The grief and shock were still there, eating at my heart like acid, but they were now secondary to something else: mission focus. This was no longer time for emotional breakdown. This was time for reconnaissance, analysis, and strategic planning. Someone was using my identity in a sophisticated fraud operation, and I needed to find out who, why, and how extensive their network was. I called Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, our 77-year-old neighbor, a retired elementary school teacher who had lived next to us since we moved to Columbus in 2019. Mrs. Patterson was one of those rare people who combined genuine kindness with sharp observation skills honed by 30 years of managing classrooms full of children. She noticed everything that happened on our quiet suburban street, and I had always appreciated her protective watchfulness over our home when I was deployed. "Jack, dear," she said in her familiar warm voice when she answered the phone, though I could detect a note of sadness that confirmed my suspicions. "I'm so terribly sorry to hear about the situation with Linda." "Mrs. Patterson, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Is anyone else living in my house?" There was a long pause, and I could almost see her choosing her words carefully. "Oh, Jack, you don't know about Brad?" Brad. That name hit me like a physical blow, a sucker punch delivered through a phone line from 8,000 miles away. Linda introduced him as a friend who was going through some financial difficulties, Mrs. Patterson continued carefully. "She said you had given permission for him to stay in the guest room temporarily. He drives a black Dodge Challenger with Georgia plates. He moved in about 3 months ago." 3 months. Right when I had started this deployment. Right when Linda had stopped asking about my schedule. "There's something else, Jack," Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I've seen Brad helping other women who Linda introduces as military wives. They come to your house regularly, always carrying briefcases or laptops, always talking about paperwork and benefits. Brad seems very knowledgeable about financial matters and military procedures." That statement sent ice-cold chills down my spine. Every good intelligence operation starts with identifying all the players involved, mapping their relationships, and understanding the scope of their activities. And now I knew there was a major player in this operation that I had never even heard of. Someone who was apparently running some kind of business out of my own home. The next day, I went to Colonel James Mitchell's office to request emergency leave. Colonel Mitchell was a career officer I had known for over a decade, a man who understood the unique challenges faced by military families, and who had always treated his soldiers with fairness and respect. "Crawford, I understand this is an incredibly difficult situation," the colonel said, after I explained the basic facts, without going into the humiliating details. "But I have to be honest with you about our current operational status. We're at the most critical phase of this mission. You have 6 more weeks here, and frankly, we're already operating with a skeleton crew after the incident last month." He was referring to an IED explosion that had injured 3 members of our unit, leaving us short-handed at the worst possible time. "Sir, I understand the operational requirements, but this is my family's entire financial future we're talking about. If I don't get back soon, I can't authorize emergency leave right now, Crawford. I wish I could, but I can't risk compromising this mission. I'm genuinely sorry." As I left his office, a transformation began in my mind. The last vestiges of the heartbroken husband were being replaced by something colder, more focused, more dangerous. If I couldn't go to them, I would have to wage this war remotely. And fortunately, I had been trained by the best intelligence professionals in the world to fight exactly this kind of war. That night, I began my own classified operation, using resources that technically existed in a legal gray area. Military intelligence databases contain vast amounts of information about American citizens, and while accessing them for personal reasons was against regulations, I justified it as investigating a potential threat to military security. After all, someone was systematically defrauding the VA using my identity, which made this a matter of national security as much as personal revenge. I began investigating Brad Sullivan with the same methodical approach I used to track enemy operatives. What I found in those databases made my blood run cold, and my anger crystallize into something much more dangerous than emotion: professional determination. Brad Sullivan, 39 years old, born in Tallahassee, Florida. 3 prior felony convictions for financial fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse charges in Florida and Texas. His pattern was disturbingly consistent: identify vulnerable targets, usually older people or military families, gain access to their financial information through romantic relationships or false friendships, systematically drain their accounts using forged documents and fake power of attorney arrangements, then disappear before the victims realized what had happened. His longest prison sentence had been 4 years in Texas for running a fake investment scheme that targeted retired military families, stealing over $600,000 before he was caught. He had been released 18 months ago. His parole officer was listed as inactive, suggesting he had either completed his parole or violated its terms and was operating under the radar. But the most chilling detail was buried in a Florida police report from 2019. Brad had been investigated, though never charged, in connection with the suspicious death of an 82-year-old widow who had changed her will to leave him everything just weeks before she died of what appeared to be a prescription drug overdose. The investigation was dropped when Brad produced documents showing she had been struggling with depression and had a history of suicide attempts. This wasn't just financial fraud. This was a predator who had found a system that worked and was systematically refining it. And now he was targeting the families of deployed military personnel, using their absence and vulnerability to perfect his methods. I contacted Victoria Hayes, a VA fraud investigator whose name I found in the database of active cases. When I called her secure line and explained my situation while sharing my discoveries about Brad Sullivan, she was quiet for so long I thought the connection had been lost. "Mr. Crawford," she finally said, her voice carefully controlled, "you might be victim number 23 in what we're now calling Operation Patriot Theft, and you might be their first major mistake." She explained that the VA's fraud investigation unit had been tracking an unprecedented surge in false disability claims over the past 8 months, all showing similar patterns: deployed military personnel suddenly filing claims for conditions that weren't in their medical records, using medical documentation that appeared legitimate but contained subtle inconsistencies that suggested sophisticated forgery. "The fake PTSD claims filed under your name have already resulted in payments totaling $127,000, she continued. "But here's what makes your case different. All previous victims were lower-ranking enlisted personnel with limited resources and no intelligence training. You're the first senior NCO with intelligence background they've targeted. They got greedy. The thought that these predators had been exploiting the real pain and suffering of combat veterans, filing false PTSD claims while genuine sufferers struggled to get the help they needed, filled me with a rage that was almost impossible to contain. But my training had taught me that emotional anger was useless. Cold, calculated planning was the only way to achieve real justice." "Ms. Hayes," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "they chose the wrong veteran to mess with. I'm going to help you bring down their entire operation." A few days later, I attempted a video call with Linda via Skype, timing it for when I calculated she would be most likely to be intoxicated and therefore less guarded in her responses. I had set up a legal recording system through the base communications center, ensuring that anything she said could be used as evidence. When she answered the call, I could immediately see that she was in an impaired state. Her normally carefully styled hair was unkempt, her makeup was smeared, and her eyes had the unfocused look of someone under the influence of alcohol or prescription drugs. Behind her, I could see our living room, but it looked different. Cheaper furniture, different decorations, signs that our home had been transformed into something I no longer recognized. "Jack," she said, her voice slurred and without any hint of remorse or shame. "You're calling late. I was just relaxing." "Linda, we need to talk about what happened. About the divorce papers, about the money." She laughed, a harsh sound that I had never heard from her before. "Oh, that. Look, Jack, you need to understand something. This isn't personal. This is business. Brad has shown me how the world really works. There's easy money out there, and military wives are entitled to it. We've been living like peasants while I could have been living like a queen." Every word was being recorded. Every admission was building the case that would eventually destroy her. "Linda, I need you to explain the withdrawals from our joint account. $87,000 doesn't just disappear." "Oh, please," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Brad explained it all to me. You military guys are so naive. You think following the rules gets you anywhere, but the smart people know how to work the system. The money was just sitting there doing nothing while I was stuck at home being the perfect little military wife. And anyway, you were never going to know. You're always deployed somewhere, always putting your precious military career ahead of your family." The irony was staggering. She was accusing me of neglecting our family while literally stealing our family's entire future. "You mentioned that other wives are doing this too. What other wives?" Her eyes went wide as she realized she had said too much. No, I shouldn't talk about that. Brad says we have to be careful about operational security." Operational security. She was using military terminology that Brad had obviously taught her. "Linda, earlier you mentioned everyone's names. Do you have some kind of list?" Her face went completely pale, and I could see fear creeping into her intoxicated eyes. "I really can't. Brad would be so angry if he knew I was talking about. I have to hang up now." The line went dead, but the damage was done. She had accidentally confirmed the existence of an organized criminal operation, mentioned operational security protocols, and referenced a list or database containing information about multiple victims. Most importantly, she had revealed that Brad Sullivan was the operational leader, the one making the strategic decisions and setting the security protocols. That night, I placed encrypted calls to my brother Tommy and Detective Ray Kowalski, a former military policeman who had become a civilian detective with the Columbus Police Department. Ray and I had served together during my second tour in Iraq, where he had earned my trust by pulling me out of a building seconds before it was destroyed by a rocket-propelled grenade. In the Brotherhood of Combat Veterans, that kind of debt never expires. "Jack," Ray said when I explained the situation, "I've already started some informal surveillance on your house. What I'm seeing is going to make you furious, but it's also going to give us everything we need to destroy these people." "Tell me everything." "They're not just living in your house. They've turned it into a full-scale operations center. I've documented at least 12 different women coming and going over the past week, all carrying briefcases, laptops, manila envelopes full of documents. They're holding what appear to be training sessions in your living room. Brad stands at your fireplace like he's giving presentations while the women take notes." Ray's voice hardened with the same anger I was feeling. "Jack, they're using your home, a home you've earned through 2 decades of service to this country, as headquarters for an operation that's systematically robbing military families. This isn't just personal anymore. This is an attack on everything we swore to defend." My isolation was beginning to transform into something much more powerful, the support of the military brotherhood that never abandons its own. But what Ray discovered over the next few days made this personal for every veteran in America. In early February, Ray's surveillance uncovered a discovery that shocked even experienced law enforcement. Brad and Linda weren't just running a small-scale financial fraud operation. They had created an elaborate criminal enterprise, using a fake charity called Heroes Home Foundation as both a money laundering front and a recruitment tool for targeting military families. "Jack, you need to hear this," Ray said during one of our nightly calls. "I followed Linda and Brad to a charity gala at the Marriott downtown. 200 people, mostly military wives and local business leaders. They raised over $40,000 in one night, ostensibly to help struggling veteran families. But I recognized at least 6 of the women from the surveillance at your house. This whole charity is a front operation. He had managed to obtain a copy of the guest list through his contacts in local law enforcement. 127 military wives had attended that event, representing families from 4 different military bases across Georgia and Alabama. Each woman had been carefully selected based on their husband's deployment status, rank, and estimated financial assets. It's their hunting ground, Jack. They're not randomly targeting military families. They're systematically identifying the most valuable targets, building relationships through this fake charity, and then recruiting the wives as accomplices in defrauding their own husbands. When I reported this intelligence to Agent Sarah Winters from the FBI's Cybercrime Division, she immediately elevated our case to federal task force status. Within 72 hours, she had obtained warrants to penetrate their computer systems and monitor their electronic communications. What the FBI discovered exceeded even my worst fears about the scope of this operation. "Mr. Crawford," Agent Winters said in a secure video call that I'll never forget, "we've accessed their primary server and recovered their operational database. This is much bigger than we initially thought." She shared her screen, showing me an Excel spreadsheet that contained information about 89 military families across 12 states. Each entry included detailed personal information: the service member's name, rank, deployment location and duration, estimated net worth, family composition, and most chillingly, a vulnerability assessment that rated each family's potential value and likelihood of successful exploitation. "They've turned patriotism into a profit margin," I said, feeling a cold rage that went beyond anything personal. This was about honor, duty, and the sacred trust that military families place in each other. "There's something else," Agent Winters continued. "Your file is flagged differently than the others. It's labeled high-value intelligence background, extra caution required. They specifically researched your military intelligence training and decided to target you anyway, seeing your background as both a challenge and an opportunity for a bigger score." The revelation that I had been specifically chosen because of my service to the country, that my intelligence training had made me a more attractive target rather than protecting me, added a layer of professional insult to the personal betrayal. But it also confirmed something crucial. These criminals had made a fatal error in judgment. They had assumed that being deployed made me helpless. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Over the following weeks, the FBI coordinated a careful and sensitive campaign to contact other victims. Agent Winters had stressed that these conversations required extreme delicacy. Many of the families didn't yet know they had been victimized, and others were still in denial about the extent of their betrayal. Each phone call was a small tragedy, revealing new layers of heartbreak and financial devastation that went far beyond mere money. The psychological impact on these families was devastating in ways that pure financial loss couldn't capture. These were people who had built their entire sense of security around trust. Trust in their spouses, trust in their community, trust in the military family support system that was supposed to protect them while they served overseas. That trust had been weaponized against them by people who understood exactly how to exploit the unique vulnerabilities of military families. But each conversation also revealed something else: an unbreakable bond between families who had been targeted specifically because of their service to America. These weren't random crime victims. They were patriots who had been punished for their willingness to sacrifice for their country, and that shared experience created a connection that transcended individual grief. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez had been deployed to Ramstein Air Base in Germany when she received a call from her bank about unusual account activity. At first, she thought it might be identity theft from an outside source, until she discovered that her husband Roberto had systematically emptied not just their savings account, but also the college funds she had been building for their 3 children over 8 years of careful budgeting. Maria was a logistics specialist who had grown up in poverty in East Los Angeles, the daughter of immigrants who cleaned office buildings to pay rent. She had joined the military specifically to break that cycle for her children, living in base housing, driving used cars, and skipping family vacations so that every extra dollar could go toward her kids' education. The $8,000 she had saved for each child represented years of sacrifice. working extra shifts, taking on additional duties for overtime pay, selling plasma when money was particularly tight. I called Roberto from Germany, Maria told me during one of our first conversations, her voice still shaking months later. He cried on the phone, said nobody was sorry, said Brad had convinced him it was an investment opportunity that would double the money. But Jack, he couldn't explain why he'd forged my signature on withdrawal forms, or why he'd never mentioned this investment before. I realized my husband wasn't just stupid or naive, he had become a criminal. The betrayal had destroyed more than their finances. Maria's children, ages 12, 14, and 16, had been forced to move in with their grandmother after Roberto was arrested. They were attending different schools, separated from their friends, watching their mother serve her country while their father sat in jail. The psychological damage to those children was immeasurable. Sergeant First Class David Thompson's story was even more complex because it involved both theft and the systematic destruction of his legitimate disability claims. David was a combat engineer who had been injured by an IED explosion during his third tour in Iraq, suffering a traumatic brain injury that left him with chronic headaches, memory problems, and difficulty concentrating. Like many combat veterans, he had been reluctant to file disability claims because he didn't want to be seen as weak or unreliable. When someone used his identity to file extensive fake medical claims for conditions he didn't have, PTSD, back injuries, hearing loss, those claims were approved and benefits were paid out to accounts he had no access to. But when David finally tried to file legitimate claims for his real injuries, he was told that his benefit allocation had been exhausted by the previous claims. The VA investigator showed me medical records that were supposedly from my treatments, David explained during one of our group calls. Detailed psychological evaluations, physical therapy notes, specialist reports, all completely fake, but sophisticated enough to fool the system. Whoever did this understood VA procedures better than I did, and I'd been in the military for 16 years. The identity theft had cost David more than money. It had cost him the medical care he desperately needed. His real brain injury was progressively worsening without treatment, affecting his ability to work, his relationship with his wife, and his capacity to be the father his young sons needed. Captain Jennifer White's case was perhaps the most professionally devastating because it involved her security clearance, the foundation of her entire military career. Jennifer was a West Point graduate with 15 years of exemplary service, recently selected for a prestigious assignment at U.S. Cyber Command. Her husband had used her military credentials and security clearance information to obtain fraudulent loans totaling $200,000 from lenders who specialized in serving military officers. When the fraud was discovered, it triggered an immediate investigation into her security clearance. In the military intelligence community, any hint of financial irregularity or criminal association can end a career instantly. Jennifer found herself suspended from duty, barred from accessing classified information, and facing the possible termination of everything she had worked towards since she was 18 years old. Jack, you have to understand, Jennifer told me during a particularly emotional conversation, I gave my entire adult life to the military. I postponed marriage, postponed having children, moved 27 times in 15 years, all because I believed in the mission. And then I find out that while I was overseas, protecting classified information, my husband was using that same clearance as collateral for criminal loans. The investigation into her security clearance had been brutal. Counterintelligence officers questioned her about every financial transaction, every relationship, every decision she had made over the past 5 years. They interviewed her colleagues, her friends, her neighbors. They wanted to know how she could have been so blind to her husband's activities, whether she had been complicit, whether she could be trusted with national security information, if she couldn't even recognize criminal behavior in her own home. Each victim's story was unique in its details, but the patterns were heartbreakingly consistent. The perpetrators had specifically targeted deployed service members during the most vulnerable periods of their service. Extended deployments, when communication was limited, high-stress assignments, when attention was focused on survival and mission completion, overseas postings where victims couldn't easily return home to address problems. The criminals had exploited intimate knowledge of military procedures, benefit systems, and family structures to maximize their theft, while minimizing their chances of detection. They understood deployment schedules, pay systems, family communication patterns, and legal procedures better than many of the military families they victimized. Most insidiously, they had weaponized the trust and loyalty that define military families against those very families. They recruited military spouses as accomplices by convincing them that they were entitled to benefits they weren't receiving, that their husbands were naive for following regulations, that there were smarter ways to access money that was rightfully theirs. But as devastating as these individual stories were, they also revealed something that our enemies had not anticipated: the unbreakable bonds of the military brotherhood. As families learned about each other's experiences, they began to organize, support each other, and demand justice not just for themselves, but for all military families. The total amount stolen across all verified cases was $3.2 million, representing the life savings, retirement funds, disability benefits, and family security of 34 military families. But beyond the monetary damage was something even more valuable that had been stolen: faith in the institutions and communities that military families depend on for support during their service. Each victim's story was unique, but the patterns were consistent. The perpetrators specifically targeted deployed service members during the most vulnerable moments of their service. They used intimate knowledge of military procedures, benefit systems, and family structures to maximize their theft while minimizing their chances of getting caught. They exploited the trust and loyalty that military families place in their spouses and support networks. But most importantly for our investigation, 34 families were willing to testify. 34 families who were determined to see justice done and to prevent other military families from suffering the same betrayal. "This isn't just about getting our money back," Maria Gonzalez told me during one of our conference calls with the FBI task force. "This is about protecting every military family in America. They targeted us because we serve. That makes this an attack on everything we've sworn to defend." By mid-February, federal investigators had mapped the complete criminal network. This wasn't just Brad Sullivan and Linda Crawford and a few opportunistic spouses. It was a sophisticated 12-person criminal organization operating in 6 cities across 4 states, with a carefully structured hierarchy, specialized roles, and systematic procedures for identifying, targeting, and exploiting military families. Brad Sullivan was the operational leader, the one who had developed the methods and recruited most of the other participants. Linda and 3 other military spouses served as inside coordinators, using their access to military systems and knowledge of procedures to facilitate the fraud. 2 former bank employees provided expertise in document forgery and electronic fund transfers. 3 individuals with connections to medical and legal services provided forged documentation. And 2 recruiters worked full-time to identify new targets through social media, veterans organizations, and military family support groups. The Heroes Home Foundation wasn't their only front operation. They had created 4 separate fake charities, 2 fraudulent investment companies, and a debt consolidation service that specifically advertised to military families. Their total theft was estimated at $4.7 million from 127 confirmed victims, with evidence suggesting the true scope might be much larger. "We've mapped the entire operation," Agent Winters told me in one of our final planning calls. "Financial flows, communication patterns, operational security measures, recruitment methods. We understand how every piece fits together. Now it's time to bring it down." She paused before delivering the news I had been waiting months to hear. "Mr. Crawford, we need you for the final phase of this operation. Emergency leave has been approved through military intelligence channels. You're coming home." The transport flight home on February 28, 2023, gave me 26 hours of travel time to prepare mentally for what was coming next. I was going home, but not to the home I had left. The house would look the same from the outside, but everything inside had been corrupted by betrayal and greed. The woman I had loved for 18 years was now a federal criminal. My possessions had been sold or stolen. My financial security had been destroyed. But I was also returning as part of an FBI task force operation that would bring justice not just for me, but for over 100 military families who had been targeted specifically because of their service to America. The isolation and helplessness I had felt in Afghanistan was being replaced by something much more powerful: the focused determination of a mission with clear objectives and devastating consequences for the enemy. When I arrived in Columbus on March 5th, Detective Ray Kowalski met me at the airport with a detailed briefing packet and a piece of equipment I hadn't expected: a sophisticated digital recording device, smaller than a pack of gum, that would capture every conversation in my house for the next 72 hours. "Jack," Ray said as we drove through the familiar streets of my hometown, "everything you see and hear from this point forward is evidence. Every emotion you feel, every reaction you have, you need to channel it into this mission. We get one shot at this, and if we mess it up, they disappear and we never see justice." The FBI's plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would return home as the betrayed husband seeking answers and reconciliation. Brad and Linda would naturally want to manipulate me, to control the narrative, and to convince me to accept the situation quietly. Their arrogance and greed would lead them to reveal details about their operation that no court testimony could provide. And once we had their confessions on tape, coordinated raids across 4 states would roll up their entire network simultaneously. Walking up to my front door felt like approaching enemy territory. The lawn needed cutting. Linda's car was in the driveway, along with the black Dodge Challenger that had become a symbol of my betrayal. Security cameras that I had never installed were mounted under the eaves. Apparently, Brad was concerned about surveillance, though not from the right sources. I used my key to open the front door, and immediately noticed that everything had changed. My military commendations and photographs had been removed from the walls and replaced with generic artwork. The furniture had been rearranged to create a more open space in the living room. My reading chair, a leather recliner that had been my favorite spot to relax between deployments, was gone entirely. Linda was sitting on a couch I had never seen before, looking older and more haggard than I remembered. The stress of living a criminal double life had aged her noticeably. Her skin was pale, her hair was thinner, and there were dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't entirely hide. Brad stood behind her, and seeing him for the first time was like finally putting a face to an enemy I had been tracking for weeks. He was shorter than I had expected, maybe 5'10", with the kind of artificial confidence that comes from successfully manipulating people. His clothes were expensive. Apparently my money had been funding quite a lifestyle upgrade. "Jack," Linda said when she saw me, not bothering to get up. There was no surprise in her voice, no shame, no recognition of the enormity of what she had done. "You're home early." "Emergency leave," I replied, each word being recorded by devices that would eventually send both of them to federal prison. "We need to talk." Brad stepped forward with that predatory smile, extending his hand as if he were greeting an old friend, rather than the man whose life he had systematically destroyed. "You must be Jack. Linda's told me so much about you. I'm Brad Sullivan. I've been helping Linda through this difficult transition." The audacity was breathtaking. He was treating my presence in my own home as an interruption to his operation, offering to help me understand Linda's position, while having no idea that I understood everything about their criminal enterprise. "Brad," I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral, while the recording devices captured every word, "Linda mentioned that you've been helping other military wives too. That's very generous of you." His eyes lit up with pride, and I realized that ego was going to be his downfall. This was a man who was genuinely proud of his criminal enterprise, who wanted to be recognized for his intelligence and sophistication in developing new methods of exploiting vulnerable families. "Well, Jack, there are a lot of military families struggling financially these days. The VA system is so bureaucratic and slow, and frankly, the government doesn't always take care of our heroes the way it should. Linda and I have developed some innovative strategies to help military wives access benefits and financial resources that they didn't even know were available to them. The confession that followed was the culmination of everything I had worked toward for months. For the next 90 minutes, as FBI agents listened from surveillance vehicles positioned strategically around my neighborhood, Brad Sullivan delivered what could only be described as a masterclass in criminal arrogance. He wasn't just admitting to his crimes, he was proud of them, genuinely believing that he had developed an innovative business model rather than a predatory criminal enterprise. Jack, you have to understand, Brad said, settling into my recliner as if he were the host and I were the guest. The military benefits system is incredibly complex and bureaucratic. Most military families never access even half of what they're entitled to. We've simply streamlined the process, helped families cut through red tape, and ensured they receive the maximum benefits available. His language was carefully crafted, full of euphemisms and business terminology that attempted to disguise theft as customer service. He called their forged documents expedited paperwork processing. Their fake medical claims became comprehensive health assessments. Their systematic identity theft was described as benefit optimization consulting. But as the conversation continued, his guard dropped and the real scope of their operation began to emerge. The VA disability system is particularly inefficient, he continued, warming to his subject. Most combat veterans are too proud or too uninformed to file proper claims for their service-related conditions. We've developed assessment tools that identify potential qualifying conditions based on deployment history, military occupation specialty, and service records. What he was describing was a sophisticated system for filing false claims using stolen personal information, but in his mind, he was providing a valuable service to deserving veterans. Linda, apparently feeling left out of the conversation and perhaps emboldened by alcohol, began adding her own details about their methods. Brad showed me how to access your VA portal using your social security number and military service information. The disability payments have been deposited directly into an account that Brad set up for us. It's amazing how much money was just sitting there waiting to be claimed. She paused, then added with a tone of genuine resentment, "You would never have filed those claims yourself because you're too stubborn to admit you might have been affected by your deployments." Brad says most military men are too proud to get the help they've earned. The recording equipment was capturing every word, every casual admission of federal crimes that would eventually result in decades of prison sentences. But the most damaging revelations came when I pushed them for specifics about their operations and other victims. You mentioned earlier that you've helped about 90 families. That's quite an operation. How do you manage something that large? Brad's chest visibly swelled with pride. This was clearly a man who wanted recognition for his intelligence and organizational skills, even if he could only get that recognition from his victims. It's all about systems, Jack. Proper documentation, efficient communication protocols, careful target selection. We've got everything computerized. Deployment schedules, financial profiles, vulnerability assessments, progress tracking. It's really quite sophisticated. He gestured toward a laptop computer sitting on my dining room table, apparently unaware that he was providing specific information about evidence that would soon be in FBI custody. The Heroes Home Foundation has been particularly effective as an outreach platform. Military wives trust charity organizations, especially ones that claim to support veteran families. We've been able to identify and recruit our most successful coordinators through those charity events. For the first time, Linda seemed to sense that Brad might be sharing too much information. She shot him a warning look, but he was too intoxicated by his own sense of cleverness to notice. "Actually, Jack, we're just getting started on a case that could be our biggest success yet. There's a young Air Force captain. Her husband's deployed to Osan Air Base in Korea right now. Intelligence background like yours, substantial savings account, excellent credit rating. She's been attending our Heroes Foundation events for about 6 weeks now, and Linda thinks she's ready to move to the next level of our consulting program." That single statement provided the FBI with everything they needed for immediate action. Brad had just admitted to ongoing criminal activity, specifically targeting another military intelligence family, providing grounds for immediate arrests to protect active potential victims. But he wasn't finished. In what would prove to be the final nail in his legal coffin, Brad proceeded to describe their money laundering operations with the casual detail of someone discussing a legitimate business venture. The financial side is actually quite elegant, he continued. We've got 4 different bank accounts spread across 3 states, plus the Heroes Foundation account for processing donations. Money comes in through the fake claims, gets processed through the charity account to legitimize it, then gets distributed to our coordinators through a network of smaller accounts. The whole system looks completely legal from the outside. As I listened to him describe the systematic exploitation of military families with the enthusiasm of a businessman discussing quarterly profits, I felt a cold clarity that transcended any personal desire for revenge. This wasn't about Linda's betrayal of our marriage anymore. This wasn't about the theft of my life savings or the destruction of my financial security. This was about an attack on the fundamental bonds of trust that hold the military community together. Every military family depends on the support of their community while their loved ones serve overseas. Spouses, friends, neighbors, support organizations, financial institutions, all of these relationships are built on the assumption that military families deserve protection and assistance, not exploitation and betrayal. Brad Sullivan and his network had weaponized that trust, turning the military community's greatest strength into its greatest vulnerability. But they had made one critical miscalculation. They had assumed that geographic separation made deployed service members helpless. They had never considered that 23 years of military intelligence training might have taught me something about patience, planning, and the systematic destruction of enemy operations. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Linda and Brad revealing additional details about their recruitment methods, their document forgery techniques, and their future expansion plans. By the time they finished talking, they had provided the FBI with enough recorded evidence to support federal charges against their entire network and to protect dozens of families who were currently being targeted. As they spoke, I found myself thinking about Maria Gonzalez's 3 children, about David Thompson's brain injury going untreated, about Jennifer White's military career hanging in the balance. I thought about the young Air Force captain in Korea whose husband had no idea that his wife was being recruited for financial exploitation while he served his country in a dangerous assignment overseas. But I also thought about the power of the military brotherhood that had rallied to support not just me, but every family that had been victimized by this operation. Ray Kowalski conducting surveillance on his own time, Agent Winters working weekends to build an ironclad case, Tommy driving 8 hours from Atlanta to provide emotional support during the darkest moments. Military families across the country willing to testify against their own spouses to prevent other families from suffering the same betrayal. The moment that I will never forget came at the very end of our conversation, when Linda looked directly at me with an expression that contained no remorse, no recognition of the pain she had caused, and no acknowledgement of the magnitude of her betrayal. Jack, you need to understand something. This isn't personal. This is business. You've always been so obsessed with honor and duty and serving your country, but you never thought about serving your family. Brad showed me that there are smarter ways to live, ways to get what we deserve instead of just accepting whatever the government decides to give us. She paused, and then delivered the line that would haunt her at sentencing. Besides, you were never going to know. You're always deployed somewhere, always putting your military career ahead of everything else. This way, at least the money was being put to good use instead of just sitting in accounts, earning practically nothing. The next morning, March 7th, 2023, at exactly 6 o'clock a.m., coordinated FBI raids took place simultaneously in Columbus, Georgia, Tallahassee, Florida, Houston, Texas, Birmingham, Alabama, Charlotte, North Carolina, and Nashville, Tennessee. At my house, 12 federal agents surrounded the building, while Agent Winters approached the front door with arrest warrants. I watched from across the street as Brad and Linda were taken into custody, while they prepared breakfast in my kitchen, using dishes I had purchased and utensils I had eaten with for years. The look of complete shock on Brad's face was almost worth 18 months of betrayal and financial devastation. This was a man who had always been in control, who had manipulated every situation to his advantage, who had convinced himself that he was smarter than the system and the people he was exploiting. In that moment, as federal agents placed him in handcuffs and read him his Miranda rights, he finally understood that he had chosen the wrong target. Linda's reaction was different. Even as she was being arrested, she kept looking at me with an expression of accusation, as if my involvement in her capture was somehow a greater betrayal than her theft of our life savings. There was no acceptance of responsibility, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no recognition that her choices had had consequences for the families she had helped destroy. Agent Winters approached me as the arrest vehicles drove away, carrying the two people who had turned my home into a criminal headquarters and my marriage into a carefully planned theft operation. "It's over, Mr. Crawford, mission accomplished." But the real victory came in the phone calls I received throughout that day, as the scope of the raids became clear. 91 arrests across 6 states, $1.3 million in cash and assets seized, complete computer systems recovered, containing evidence of additional victims and ongoing crimes, bank accounts frozen, preventing further theft from families who didn't yet know they had been targeted. Maria Gonzalez called me that afternoon, her voice breaking with emotion. "Jack, you saved my family. My husband comes home from Germany next month, and now we actually have something for him to come home to. Our kids can still go to college because of what you did." David Thompson's wife called to tell me that the VA had expedited review of her husband's legitimate disability claims now that the fraudulent filings had been identified and removed from his record. Jennifer White called to report that her security clearance investigation had been suspended, pending resolution of the criminal cases, meaning her military career was no longer in jeopardy. The legal process took 8 months, but when it concluded on September 15, 2023, justice was both swift and comprehensive. In federal court in Atlanta, I watched as the people who had betrayed not just me, but the entire military community, faced the consequences of their choices. Brad Sullivan was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole, plus full restitution to all victims and forfeiture of all assets obtained through criminal activity. The judge noted that his targeting of military families while they served overseas constituted a particularly heinous form of betrayal that strikes at the foundation of military service. Linda received 8 years in federal prison, plus supervised probation and mandatory restitution. Her sentencing hearing was the most difficult moment of the entire process, not because I felt sympathy for her, but because it represented the final acknowledgement that the woman I had loved and trusted for 18 years had never really existed. The network as a whole received a combined total of 89 years in federal prison sentences. More importantly, $4.7 million was recovered and returned to victim families, and new federal protocols were implemented to prevent similar operations from targeting military families in the future. The judge's final statement at the sentencing hearing resonated with every veteran in America. The defendants systematically targeted the families of service members who were deployed overseas, defending our nation and our freedoms. They exploited the absence of these heroes to commit crimes that strike at the very foundation of military service, the trust that families can depend on each other and on their communities while their loved ones are in harm's way. This court will not tolerate such calculated betrayal of our military families. As I left the courthouse that day for the final time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in almost 2 years: complete peace. I now live in a cabin outside Billings, Montana, surrounded by mountains that remind me why I served for 23 years, to protect something beautiful and worth preserving. The silence here is different from the oppressive quiet of betrayal. It's the peaceful silence of healing and new beginnings. My military pension provides comfortably for my simple needs. I've found meaningful work as a consultant with the VA's Fraud Prevention Division, helping to develop new protocols and training programs that will protect military families from the kind of systematic exploitation I experienced. It turns out that 23 years of intelligence experience translates perfectly to financial crime investigation. The letters started arriving in December 2023, and they continue to this day. Handwritten notes from families whose lives were saved by our investigation, whose futures were preserved by our determination to see justice done. Maria Gonzalez sent a photograph of her husband's homecoming ceremony, their three children running across the tarmac to embrace him while she stood watching with tears of joy, knowing their family's financial future was secure. David Thompson wrote a 4-page letter describing how the recovery of his stolen benefits allowed him to finally seek treatment for his combat-related PTSD, and how his improved mental health had saved his marriage and restored his relationship with his children. Jennifer White's letter came with a promotion announcement. She had been selected for major and was being assigned to a prestigious position at the Pentagon, her career fully restored and her reputation cleared. But the letter that meant the most came from Captain Sarah Mitchell, the Air Force intelligence officer whose family had been Brad's next target before our investigation ended his operation. She wrote simply, "You saved us from a betrayal we never saw coming. My husband returns from Korea next month to a family that's still intact because of your courage. 127 families protected, $4.7 million recovered, 38 children's college funds restored, dozens of military careers saved from false accusations and fraudulent claims, a criminal network dismantled and its leaders imprisoned." The numbers tell one story, but the letters tell another. Stories of marriages preserved, dreams protected, faith in justice restored, and trust in the military brotherhood reaffirmed. In March 2024, I was invited to speak at the annual VA Fraud Prevention Conference in Washington, D.C. Standing before an audience of over 400 veterans advocates, law enforcement professionals, and military family support specialists, I shared the lessons learned from our investigation. They thought they knew me, I told the audience. They thought I was just another deployed soldier, too far away to fight back, too trusting to question their lies, too proud to admit I had been victimized. They didn't know that betraying one veteran means answering to all of us. The brotherhood that had supported me through the darkest months of my life had grown into something larger and more powerful, a nationwide network of protection for military families everywhere. New warning systems were established to alert deployed service members to suspicious account activity. Training programs were implemented to help military spouses recognize and resist recruitment by criminal organizations. Background check procedures were strengthened for anyone seeking access to military family financial information. Most importantly, a clear message was sent to anyone who might consider targeting military families. We protect our own. We never give up on each other. And justice will always find those who pray and the families of those who serve. Sometimes, late at night in my Montana cabin, I think about Linda and wonder if she ever truly understood what she threw away. 18 years of marriage, a lifetime of shared memories, the respect and love of her family and community, a secure financial future, all traded for temporary money and the false promises of a career criminal. But then I read another letter from a family we saved, and I realized that her betrayal, devastating as it was, led to something far greater than our individual marriage could ever have been. It led to justice for over 100 families, protection for thousands more, and a strengthening of the bonds that hold the military community together. I had survived war zones around the world, had faced enemy fire and roadside bombs, and the constant threat of death in service to my country. I wasn't going to be taken down by betrayal in my own home, no matter how calculated or cruel. The mission never really ends for those who have served. It just evolves and takes new forms. From protecting freedom overseas to protecting families at home, service continues in whatever way it's needed most. The desert wind in Afghanistan had carried that email that shattered my world, but the mountain wind in Montana carries the knowledge that sometimes being broken is the first step toward becoming something stronger and more purposeful than we ever imagined possible. They didn't know what they were dealing with when they decided to target a military intelligence veteran and his family. They thought my training would make me a more valuable target, never realizing it would also make me a more dangerous opponent. They found out. Justice had the last word, and in the end, That's all any soldier can ask for, that the mission is completed, that those we swore to protect are safe, and that the price of freedom is paid by those who would destroy it, not by those who defend it. The brotherhood endures, the mission continues, and justice, however long it takes, always finds its target.